Today is we are commencing the cycle of the lunar return, which is to say that the focus of the speech of the Guru Mandala goes somewhat subterranean. The solar return is very much like the sun. It is direct, radiant, totally illuminating to any and all. But the lunar return is a little bit more subversive because it is like the moon. It is in the receivership of the radiance of the sun. But unlike the sun, it is not a luminous body unto itself. It reflects the light of the sun. Which is to say, the rays of the Guru Mandala, the rays of the Guru Shakti, which are sun-like, as we begin to speak of the lunar return, we begin to speak of ourselves, because are we not satellites which orbit that great light and draw light and sustenance from it? And so we begin to find that the rays of the sun bombard us and begin to express our underlying content. We become the subject. In the Yoga Tantra, it's often thought that the lunar cycle of the transmission is the most powerful because the light of the transmission has found its target, and having struck and begun to interact with the substance, the content of the Guru Mandala itself, and we, its occupants. A very powerful, very deep, and thunderous earthquake-like rumble begins to occur in the lunar cycle, because it is the light gone into the depths, which is of course where the action is, where our content truly arises, where our content that is often veiled over by the various structures of klesha, afflictive emotion, wrong understanding, karmically derived forms of causality and effect, out of which we have assembled our ego-born self. And in this case, we begin to see that the ego-born self is not the true I, it is not the true self, but is a false refuge that is drawing the light and reflecting the light of the true self, reflecting the light of the Guru. At the same time, claiming its empirical prominence. Isn't that what the ego does? The egocentric I, as it draws the light of the self, as it draws the light of the Guru to itself, and begins to be reflected and radiate that light. It says, it is I that am bright, it is I that am the source of light. Producing a kind of false refuge. This is the trick of the ego. And so what we see in the beginning of the lunar cycle is an extremely effective relationship between the radiance, the grace waves the light of the source of grace truly in deep interconnection. With its object. So we find that the lunar cycle of the transmission, oftentimes, and most often at times, like when we have a transmission of an intensive or a retreat, it will be astrologically placed. And there will be several days between the solar dynamic of the event, the creation of the retreat, and the subsequent lunar cycle. It might be as much as 2 weeks later. And the transmission will roll through the system, ever deeper, ever unseen. As it comes to the lunar cycle, it will begin to bear intense fruit. Oftentimes, if you'll notice the path of your life, as we turn the wheel of the Dharma, which is the cycle of teaching. And hard light has a very aggressive cycle by most standards of practicing Dharma centers. The tempo of the darshans and the force of the darshans on Thursdays and one intensive per every 6 weeks. And the longer events, the retreats. All astrologically significant. So the mandalas are very focused. You'll see that there is always a kind of relationship, a ratio between the event itself and the flowing through the wheel of time to the completion of the lunar cycle, the full moon, wherein you'll have a very powerful experience both of the solar and lunar cycle beginning to emerge over the 3 days of the waxing and waning moon. Your system will turn. There'll be a very powerful release of klesha born, proliferating obscuration, purification, and a deepening of experience. One of the things that I found, and in that I'm teaching like I was taught. Baba had a very aggressive schedule. And when he would be in-house, he would actually give darshan every day. You had to face him every day. And gave 2 intensives a month plus extra events. So the entire ashram was always in a completely mad state. You never saw so many whacked out people in one place.
Well, you did a fine job.
There should have been a reality show. It would have been good. And it was very much, and this is where you run into the basic dharma of the space around a teacher, because you want to have an orderly surface, because beneath the surface it's always extremely turbulent and there's so much going on. And so just to do the kind of work of the awakening and training of human beings, it's always best to have this basic rhythmic tempo of teaching and transmission that has an orderliness to it, because the mind and the body subtly attenuates to it. And And this way you can, while there's always lots going on the surface of things, beneath the surface is where, of course, the action is in this spiritual training bag. And that in this way, you will see this quality over and over again in all of the dynamics of spiritual life, in the dynamics of temporal life, your day-to-day existence. And you'll also see it in the relationship between the teacher and student. There is a kind of level of imputed reality. In other words, we assemble this reality, the orderliness of naming a place and date. We agree to meet and deal with all of the imputed terms of the order of existence. There's a secondary subtle level of dependent interaction, where the qualities of all of the elements of the overall whole are always in a constant cycling churn and constant transition, constant transformation. And this way it's always being affected by the coming together of the unconscious energy of the creation of apparent existence and the conscious energy of the transmission of the speech of the Guru and the wheel of Dharma. And in a third reality, there's a kind of absolute reality, where consciousness arises as pure consciousness. It is empty in nature, beyond all qualities. It is. Its only objective quality is emptiness itself, and acts as a kind of support for the expression of what we call the unconscious aspect of the apparent creation, the world of apprehended experience, which is both imputed and dependent, of dependent origin, interacting with the aspect of absolute consciousness, absolute, which is empty, which is all you can say. It has no quality, or does not arise, does never begin. It is said to be without origin, so thus it is without end. But at the same time, it is not infinite, nor is it finite. And the subject of the objective nature of emptiness is the ocean of consciousness itself. Absolute in its speech. So we begin to see at the absolute level, even the idea of emptiness is an objective apprehension of that which is even more subtle and more profound, of the nature of pure consciousness. or supra-consciousness, consciousness before consciousness. Again, we see this idea of three in the expression of the generation of the mandala. Whenever you come into contact with a turning of the wheel of Dharma, which is a teaching, where the power of that wheel is revealed, and it's a formal date at this time, at this place. The wheel will turn. And you always hear me say we'll be generating the mandala. And as I've told you, the mandala doesn't, the qualities and quantities doesn't come out of thin air. It's not just something that somebody thought up and that's what we're doing. It arises from the content of the three worlds, both relative and absolute. So we have in the relative frame of reality, we have the three worlds. They are imputed, which is the agreed upon terms, the imputation of this reality. The sky is blue, the firmness of the earth. The location of Ennis House in Santa Barbara, those are all imputed. But they rest upon a level of reality that is dependent. It is dependent, which is to say it rests on the wheel of cyclic existence, the wheel of dependent origin. And it's 12 spokes of interdependent support. The implication of the wheel of dependent origin, interdependent origin, expresses the idea of the difference between ignorance, source of suffering, and the relief and release from suffering, which is the realization of emptiness, that it doesn't truly exist except as an interdependent assembly of imputed terms. In other words, there is no such thing as an external reality, a flower, the sky. When we look deeply into the matter, it is an assembly of qualities that produces an effect. But there is no skyness of sky that is absolute sky. What we experience as sky is imputed and interdependent. And so we have, this basically defines the apprehension of the unconscious creation, constantly in flux. It doesn't arise as that. It's an assembly of qualities. For example, just taking the idea of the sky and the understanding of the imputed and dependent qualities of the sky between a scientist, a physicist, and a 5-year-old child. They both experience the sky with total intensity. But their understanding and experience of the sky are completely different when you understand their imputed and interdependent basis of the sky. One is not more significant than the other because both are experiencing the sky with total intensity. But the imputed terms and the interdependent qualities of the experience of the sky are completely different, which means that the sky is capable of existing in two frames of experience, neither of which are fixed or absolute. which means the sky is something beyond its imputed and dependent terms, and that it can constantly shift. Whether it's being perceived at all. The dynamic of sky with no perceiver still exists, but its imputed terms and dependent terms are different. And you see this again and again in all things. Unconscious dynamic of relative experience of a given thing. And then we have the idea of absolute experience of a given thing, which essentially goes through the entire list of imputed terms, the entire list of dependent terms, and cancels them out. And relates them to zero, which gives rise to an idea of emptiness, which is the first form of the absolute experience of the sky, as void, as empty. And thus we have the unconscious aspect of the apparent world, in its terms both imputed and dependent, supported by the 12 spokes of interdependent origin, and its underlying emptiness, which is the object of the subject of a kind of inconceivable consciousness, ocean of consciousness, that, tattvamasi. Is empty in nature, yet apparent. This is the conversation of the retreat. And this is the conversation that is inherent in the guru-disciple relationship.